We begin with Greenland, an Arctic landmass with a sparse population, which is now standing at the center of a growing global standoff. In the latest move, US President Donald Trump has vowed to 100% follow through on his threat, tariffs on European allies. The reason? They refuse to support his demand that America takes control of the territory. Trump says it's imperative for national and world security, but Europe is pushing back. Denmark was the first to draw a red line. His foreign minister made it clear Greenland is not for sale and threats won't change that. Other European countries, including the UK, also made it clear that threats are not the way forward.
A trade war is in no one's interest. And my job is always to act in the UK's national interest. That is why our commitment to international law and to alliances founded on trust is not abstract or ideological. It's practical. It's about stability, predictability, and fairness.
But Trump is unmoved. On Monday, when asked whether he would use force to seize the territory, the president replied, no comment. Well, he also confirmed that tariffs are coming. Under Trump's plan, Britain will face a 10% tariff on all goods from February the 1st. That jumps to 25% by June, unless Washington reaches a deal to purchase Greenland. The same threat applies to Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, and also Denmark, whose defense minister issued a stark warning.
If this issue, which is so difficult and which is so tense in relation not only to the Danish realm but fundamentally to Europe, and for that matter also the future of NATO, then I do not think there is any need to stand and go through one by one what we have discussed. But I do see a Secretary General who is very aware of the difficult situation both the Danish realm is in, but for that matter also the challenges that exist in relation to NATO.
European allies are taking it seriously. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has vowed an unflinching response to Trump's threats, saying the bloc plans massive investments in Greenland. And some countries have already sent troops to the territory. Denmark has also sent additional forces and is now proposing NATO surveillance operations over Greenland. Meanwhile, the United States is preparing to deploy aircraft to a key military base on the island. Well, as everyone moves the pieces on the chessboard, Trump says he had a very good phone call with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Various meetings are planned in Switzerland at the Davos summit this week. But diplomacy is being overshadowed by something else. A startling text message exchange. Trump recently told Norway's Prime Minister he no longer felt an obligation to think purely of peace because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, Norway's Prime Minister had to clarify something basic. He said the government does not decide Nobel winners. In the text message, Trump also questioned Denmark's legal and historic claim to the island and repeated his argument that Denmark cannot protect Greenland from Russia or China. Well, later, Trump dismissed the Nobel Prize altogether.
No, I don't care about the Nobel Prize. First of all, a very fine woman felt that I deserved it and really wanted me to have the Nobel Prize, and I appreciate that. If anybody thinks that Norway doesn't control the Nobel Prize, they're just kidding. They have a board, but it's controlled by Norway, and I don't care what Norway says.
But this isn't just about Greenland. A couple of days ago, Trump unveiled what he called the Board of Peace for Gaza. He invited several countries to be a part of it, provided they pay a $1 billion fee. The invitation was rejected by France, and thus the US president planned his revenge. He attacked his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron. He shared private messages where Macron told Trump that he could not understand what the US president is doing on Greenland. And then he threatened tariffs again, a 200% tax on French wine, as he continues to use tariffs as leverage and security as justification. And here's the question. If allies can be coerced like adversaries, if NATO unity can be shaken by tariffs and threats, and if Greenland becomes a battleground for ego and influence, then what else is ahead over the next 3 years of a Donald Trump presidency? Well, for more on this, we're joined now by Meredith Crowley, who's a professor of international economics, joining us live from Cambridge in the UK. a very warm welcome to you. To what extent do you think Europe is beginning to flex its muscles and not just offer a smiling face to Donald Trump's demands?
Well, I think the European Union has been quite sober and logical in its approach with President Trump. So during the time when President Trump was first threatening severe tariffs on the European Union, they took a very logical approach. They tried to de-escalate the amount of tension. So they keep going back to what can we say that is sensible and logical? What threats can we make that we're actually prepared to carry through? And then how can we try to be constructive in the face of a lot of chaos in terms of policy ideas coming from Washington? So I think in terms of the muscle that's already being flexed, the European Union is usually quite strategic whenever it has trade tensions with the U.S. Since, long before President Trump, they tell the United States, if you, do such and such action, we will raise tariffs on the following things. And they always pick very sensible goods that will have the most negative political impact for whatever party is in power. So that's very smart and strategic of them. I think the other way in which Europe is really showing its economic muscle is one of the logical concerns that might be at the heart of some of the chaos of policy suggestions by the president is a U.S. longstanding concern about the extent to which European states are funding their own fair share of NATO defense. And over the past several years, we've seen, in response to increased, expressions of concern by the U.S. about the level at which European countries are funding their own militaries. We've seen commitments coming from the European NATO members to increase their spending. And so it might be that, President Trump, there could be some legitimate concern within the United States on the military side about the security of Greenland as part of NATO. And President Trump could possibly be, satisfied if the European states came forward and said, we're going to establish bases on Greenland. Denmark may be taking the lead in support and partnership with other European-based NATO members, might reduce some of this security concern that President Trump has expressed. On the other hand, it's clear that President Trump's policy pronouncements are all over the place.
Right, well, let me just jump in there if I may there. You mentioned goods briefly. How damaging could these US tariffs be if they're carried out to European countries?
So it depends how high they go. I think logically, it's really not in it's not in the United States' self-interest to impose any tariffs above 30%. So if you impose a tariff of 30% on merchandise from the European Union, you're going to have a real reduction in flows, and that will have a short-term negative impact on the European Union. That said, higher levels of tariffs, numbers bigger than that the president throws out, I think are just not credible because they could get to the rate at which they prohibit trade from the European Union. And the US really doesn't want that, not in a deep way. So he's making these threats, I think, to try to induce certain behavior. In the long run, I think, if he's very angry, we could see tariffs against the European Union maybe settling at something like 10%. That would have a negative impact on trade flows from Europe to the United States. But I think I wouldn't expect those to survive, meaning that if another administration came in, there's no reason for the United States to be restricting trade against Europe, and no future administration would support that.
So overall then, let me just ask you this, if I may. To what extent is NATO facing an existential threat here over the Greenland issue?
So I think the existential threat to NATO depends on President Trump's support within the United States. And I think he does not have the support of the U.S. Congress in this, adversarial relationship with NATO. I think if you canvass, Republican members of the party of the Congress and you ask Democrats, they're going to tell you they think this whole thing is, just silly. It's bonkers. NATO is a very important alliance for the United States. So I don't think he has the domestic support within the United States. This is different from, say, earlier initiatives when he, threatens import tariffs on China. Those are controversial in the US, but they do have some groups of Americans who support them. I think breaking the NATO alliance has zero support in the United States.
OK, we'll leave it there. Meredith Crowley, we appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
The world doesn't fit in boxes, so why should your news? From battlefields to negotiation tables, from internet outrage to real-world injustice. The conversations everyone is having and the ones they're avoiding. It's the same show, but this new year, Firstpost America gets a new look. I'm Cary Johnston, and this is Firstpost America.